Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Kelly, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Hope you're having a good week so far. So we do have a few stories to get through today, and let's start with a new resource from Michigan's Unemployment Insurance Agency. They today unveiled their Employer Help Center for Michigan businesses. So Brian, what can you tell us about the resources available there?
What some of you might know is that SBAM has for the last year been participating with the Unemployment Insurance Agency in their modernization task force or work group. And so some of that work is on functionality for the future, but one of the needs that had been identified was just the ability to deal, or the ability of employers to be able to get quick and timely answers to ease the kind of administrative burden of dealing with the agency. And they have released, actually just today, so today it was released, although we got a look at it late last week, what they're calling the Employer Help Center for Michigan businesses. And we shared the link so you could take a look at it. We'd love to get your thoughts, especially if you have a lot of interaction with the Unemployment Insurance Agency. Your thoughts, and got a nice feedback loop that we could share. But looking at the announcement here, it says that the new Help Center, Employer Help Center, is a one-stop online toolkit that uses plain language and clean design to answer employer questions and explain UIA programs. So registering your business, managing employee claims, submit reports and payments, manage account settings. They'll have FAQs and other information resources there, and then of course a way to contact the Unemployment Insurance Agency. So a great effort, definitely being trying to be responsive to an identified need that employers had shared. Would love your insight as you use it. So please do follow that link if you want to just kind of nose around the site, or when something comes up and you've got to use it, just whatever your experience is, if you're happy with it, have suggestions, have any input, we'd be happy to receive that, communicate it into the system. And by the way, if you like it, I would include that. So we do like to provide positive feedback when warranted. So if you find it to be quite helpful, then that would be great insight to have as well.
All right, next up on the list today are some potential changes that could happen with the employee retention credit. So what can you tell us there, Brian?
The employee retention credit, one of the pandemic era tax credits that was in the news quite a bit several months ago, as the IRS stopped filing or stopped processing claims to it because they were concerned with just the fraudulent claims that they were finding in other inappropriate tax credit filings. And they're past that freeze. They're back to processing those claims again, but they would like to put an end to new claims being processed, or at least some people in the system would. So in the House of Representatives, there was a bill that was passed that would end the employee retention credit early, January 31st, 2024. So in the past, like last week, it would say that no claims would be processed after that date. That's when the bill passed the House. Now, it still would have to go through the Senate. It would still have to get signed by the president, which we don't really have a good sense at this point if that's going to be the case. But it is on the table to end that early. And as they deal with issues with respect to the budget deficit that the country has, the way that has the overall debt has definitely gotten more attention lately. The idea of scaling back or ending credits early it seems more plausible or likely to me than perhaps it would have at other junctures. So just something to be aware of. Again, not law yet, but it did pass the House of Representatives. And given the environment of concern over the deficit spending of the country, I wouldn't be terribly surprised if this one got put to bed a little early. Now, if you already have a claim that was filed, it won't affect that. Okay, so if you already have something and you're waiting on it, this bill would not go retroactive and stop claims that are out there that were filed before January 31st. The other thing, just one other item, is that because of the concern that there have been fraudulent claims that have been filed, this bill that passed would extend the period of time that this part of a tax return could be audited. So it would give them, the IRS, a few more years to identify claims for audit and subject them to it. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. But again, if you have an unpaid employee retention credit filed before January 31st, regardless of whether this bill passed, your filing wouldn't be interrupted by this.
All right, well, thanks for the report. We did share a story related to this in our newsletter today. So just another reminder, if you're not a member, you should be, and you'll get access to those newsletters that we send out every Monday. And I shared the link in the chat here too. So another story we talked about today in our newsletter is this report that suggests CEOs are maybe now seeing the value of remote and hybrid work after kind of a lot of, I don't know if there's been a lot of conversation about in-person, remote, hybrid, and how we work now that we're 4 years, past the pandemic. So what did you learn, Brian?
Yeah, this survey of CEOs, which would tend to be bigger companies, but kind of indicative generally of what's happening out there in workplace trends. There are hardly any CEOs in this year's survey, 158 of them. Only 6 had indicated that they would prioritize the return or increasing the amount of time that office workers spent in the office. Or I shouldn't say office workers. They always say back to the office, doesn't necessarily mean office workers. But in any event, that's pretty low compared to the earlier years past the pandemic, when it was kind of thought that at some point it would get back to normal. This would really signal to me that business leaders that maybe have in the past wanted to have a more wide-scale return to in-person work are essentially giving up on that. The survey shared it as I'm now kind of like seeing the value of in-person work. But I think reading between the lines, it might just be the idea of, look, it's changed. We want to be competitive and attract the best talent, that this is just one of the things, being more flexible is going to be required. So a few other things that came out of this. About a quarter of U.S. workers engage in remote work at least part of the week. And so a couple of points of reference. So at the height of the pandemic, it was 47%. So a quarter is a lot less than before. But pre-pandemic, that number is only 3%. So a really, really big change to the pre-pandemic norm to say about a quarter have remote or flexible work environments. Again, only 4% are prioritizing bringing workers back to in-person or at least over the next year. Only about 4% identified that. And then 56% of workers continue to work in a hybrid or fully remote schedule. 73% of respondents report difficulty enticing workers to return to the office. So not new, but what's new, I think, is just the idea of leadership, more leadership in companies saying, okay, this is just going to be the new normal. And then also there's a belief, or what shows up in there is that mandates to return work against attempts to retain workers, but especially women. And then 27% of HR leaders say they have implemented or are considering implementing a 4-day work week, which was something that kind of stuck out to me, because it wasn't that long ago when the idea of 4-day work weeks was pretty rare that 27% either are doing it or are thinking of doing it. Feels pretty important. And then let's see, 63% have considered or are implementing allowing teams to essentially set their own schedules. So this is, I think, just kind of an indication that the post-pandemic era habits they're settled in and feel pretty permanent at this point.
All right, another issue as this in this post-pandemic world is related to education. And we've covered issues pertaining to education on the briefing previously, because obviously today's students are tomorrow's workforce. But there's a new study out from Harvard and Stanford that outlines the stats on the impact the pandemic had on learning loss. So what does that say?
Yeah, this is so Harvard and Stanford had got together, and they're trying to look at how much recovery is being made at different grade levels. And it's kind of disheartening. And they looked at not every state, but many states, including Michigan. And so in Michigan, schools rose by 7% of a grade equivalent in math and 1% of a grade equivalent in reading in 22 and 23. I mean, so it's just very, very little recovery happening. And then when they extrapolate kind of the trends and where things are going, that it would take another 5 years to get back, to get kind of like to normal education gains. And if you really, though, if you count out the years, that would say that it's really be a matter of the kids that were disrupted by the pandemic. Most of them would be out of the system by then. So naturally, the pandemic learning losses would no longer be showing up in the scores of the students because those students aren't in school anymore. So so it is I would say generally a disheartening look at the recovery levels of education in the system, in that some kids just fell behind and really haven't caught up relative to cohorts that came before, and hopefully those that come after will be in a better position. So I would view it as kind of confirmation of what some of our standardized test results that we've covered on this briefing before have shown. The new information is just that it's not really getting better.
And speaking of standardized tests, Dartmouth College is changing its admissions process.
It wasn't that long ago when many universities were moving away from the ACT and the SAT as part of the admittance to college, indicating that performance of GPA in high school had more to say, it was more of an indication on how somebody was going to perform in college, as opposed to these standardized tests, which in some ways they looked at it like, some kids are disadvantaged and so won't perform very well in these tests, and so it can be discriminatory to put too much weight on the tests. Now that we've gotten to a point where there's been, in high school, there's a lot of grade inflation. So what does a GPA even mean anymore? It's changing all the time, and so that's not necessarily a good indication. Essays aren't really giving universities much help, because it's just hard to really control for who wrote that essay and how much help did they get, or maybe these days maybe the robots wrote it. But there's so like, what's the most reliable of exactly where a student is, and so the research is now pointing back to ACT and SAT scores as being more predictive of a student's ability to make it through in college. And so it raises that same old question about, well, if they were discriminatory before, is it discriminatory today? But it's interesting, the article that was published with these results, it did kind of answer that question. And it's a matter of, when you look at the socioeconomic situation that a student is in, the test score, the standardized test score, is still is still relevant. And so maybe in case you might have an SAT with a 1400 score, but it's somebody who grew up in poverty, and you could look at it and say, wow, that person must have a lot of perseverance. That person must have a lot of um, a lot of determination, the ability to juggle a lot of competing interests and to still make education a priority and do well, as opposed to, say, a student that might have a 1550 or 1600 score, but grew up in relative affluence. Like, you look at those, it's not that there would be necessarily one dividing line. Universities still could use judgment in terms of the standardized test, but at least you could tell, is this the type of student that is going to be able to make it or not? Because of course, taking out a big student loan for a year of college and flunking out doesn't help them if they're not really prepared. So that's it's a reversal here, and I think probably this reversal is somewhat rooted in just what's happened since the pandemic, but then also the relative unreliability of these measures like essay writing that really don't tell a university as much as perhaps it used to in the past.
All right, we're going to switch gears now and talk about a report from Allied Van Lines about migration. You've covered the U-Haul report in this with these stats before, but is this any different?
Yeah, so the Allied Van Lines is essentially echoing what U-Haul has already reported, which is that there's net outbound migration of people from Michigan, and Michigan has now been in the bottom 5 for the last 5 years in their numbers. And we do have some Midwest company in the bottom 5. So the highest outbound ratio was Illinois, number 2 California, Pennsylvania was number 3, Michigan number 4, and then rounding out the bottom 5 was Washington State, and Washington State being definitely a state that has become relatively less attractive in recent years, especially. So there's unfortunately, it highlights or underscores the challenges that we have, which is that the domestic migration, so movement between states, is something that it's a game that Michigan's been losing at here for a while. It was turned around for a little while in the middle of the last decade, but while our population did last year grow a little bit, it was mainly because of international immigration. Had it not been for international immigration, Michigan's it wouldn't have just been slow growth rates. We would have gone down because birth rates are down, average age of the population is higher, and outbound migration is confirmed with this kind of a perfect storm of elements or factors working against our population.
Okay, I think you have a Data Monday report for us next.
I do. It's a pretty interesting one too. So jobs report came out, and so I wanted to share with you one of the things I think makes the Federal Reserve's decision on when to start reducing interest rates really complicated, because back in November, looking at this report, okay, so November would be right here. You could look at this and say, kind of looks like a downward trend, right? But then December and January both coming in higher than what analysts had expected. So if you're to go back to, say, July and look at these 7 months, you'd say, well, it looks like an upward trend. But then you also look at January to January. Last January was a really big month as well. So I think that the Federal Reserve will certainly be content to just wait for a little while. But looking at this data, I think you'll understand as we get through this report why they're pre-scripting or trying to set expectations that we're just going to wait and see, because there really doesn't seem to be a big incentive to move rates up or down, because in this case, you see jobs, or having the jobs going to come in at a soft landing was the goal. But as you look across the sectors too, it's spread pretty well. Education and health coming in at the top again. I think that was the same last month. Business services looking a little stronger. I was surprised to see retail as strong as it is on here, and then government up 36,000. I think the last several months government was up in the maybe the top one or two, and kind of a hiring spree over the last year. So that seems to be settling down. But then looking at average hourly earnings. So just the workforce, how much has it increased? And it was kind of settling back down, now back up to 4.5%. Now keep in mind, this is annualizing just last month, but still, the idea of the jobs report and kind of wages pushing up are two things that would suggest that it's not yet time to reduce interest rates, given that consumer confidence and earnings and jobs are all kind of pushing up, and would suggest that inflationary concerns are not as far in the rearview mirror as perhaps some would have hoped. Unemployment now, it's been 24 months that it's been down below 4%, which is pretty significant. So all these factors would suggest that while they certainly, there is no indication, I don't think really any chance that the Federal Reserve will increase interest rates. The idea that they might wait several months before they start to lower them looks pretty plausible given this information. Now we see overall, this is a little bit more complicated though. A couple factors here that make the bag a little bit mixed. First is overall full-time employment. And it's kind of busy graphs here. You look at the period over period comparison on the bottom, and then the absolute terms at the top. You see the absolute terms has come down a little bit. It's actually down about 1.3 million total full-time employment. Doesn't mean that people became unemployed. It could mean retirements. There's a lot of factors that are at play in this sort of thing. But you see full-time employment coming off a little bit. I thought this was kind of interesting that we have not separated out or covered in the past, but just looking at temporary help. So temps, this was a lot of months in a row of in the negative territory, and then back up positive. So more use of temps for the first time in quite a while. Average hourly earnings for all employees, actually a little bit higher than the hourly number I shared earlier. And then the other one that I thought was just a kind of interesting to note is that the average weekly hours that employees are working is now settling into what looks to be a historically normal level. So overall, if I'm always, when I look at this, in terms of the economic conditions, especially the fight against inflation and the use of U.S. monetary policy to keep it in check, everything in this tells me that they're not going to decrease rates next month. So there was like the odds markets were sharing a 50-50 type of a chance. And there's a lot of pressure because it's an election year to start bringing those rates down. But looking at the data, I'd be pretty surprised unless by the time they get to next month's meeting that there's additional data that shows that, yeah, things are still slowing, or things are still, the risk of that recession is now bigger than the risk of inflation. Because if while I have alluded several times that there's this this play about it's an election year and the never increase interest rates in election year, but the idea of inflation jumping back up to higher levels, I'm sure that the policymakers would find that quite untenable. That was such a huge embarrassment that it got so far out of control before they took any real steps to try to stop it, and then it's taken so long to get it back in check. Finally, now to a sustained period of several months where inflation is lower than wage growth. So there's actual real wage growth happening for the first time in a while. that's, I just don't think they'll want to put that in jeopardy. And so they'll probably move much more cautiously. So that's why sometimes all these things, you think it's all good, all that information mostly looks like good information. But when your biggest concern is inflation, all of those factors, I think, are going to cause them to pause a little while longer.
Well, thanks as always for your analysis and bringing it all together for us. That is about everything we have for today. I do want to remind our viewers that on Wednesday at 1 p.m. we'll be hosting a webinar with our partners at Taylor English Law Firm to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act and beneficial ownership. That is a free webinar. So if you're interested in attending or want to make sure you get it on demand, please register at sbam.org/events. And then we will be back here Thursday at 3 p.m. Have a great week.
Thanks, everybody. See you on Thursday.